47 minutes is long enough to rehearse an entire life in the small, precise movements of waiting. Clare Montgomery sat by the fogged window of the café and watched the city make itself soft. Snow lay in slow, polite flakes, each one a small erasure of the hard edges of December. Car horns muffled, neon halos smeared into watercolor. Her watch read 5:47. Her coffee, now lukewarm, steamed in a way that suggested patience, not urgency. She had a list of reasons why she was here: Margaret's insistence, the unspoken contract with a self who had, until a year ago, been married to schedules and certainty. But the reasons narrowed and sharpened under the light from the street lamp, until all that was left was the simple, almost indecent possibility of being seen. She had come with rules. Sit in a corner where the view of the door was full. Do not take her phone out unless necessary. Leave at the first sign of reverie. She had told herself she would be observed, not involved. Margaret, who had been more blunt and less subtly manipulative than Clare liked, had texted at 11 with a line that had hovered on her screen all day. Be kind, be brave. Clare had saved the message and given it the kind of private affection she usually reserved for balance sheets and calendar invites. The café was small enough that its life felt intimate, and large enough to be anonymous. Regulars claimed stools at the counter like small kingdoms. The owner, a man with eyebrows that had never found an arch, knew not only Clare's order but the exact way she liked her sleeve folded over a saucer. He had offered her a refill without asking, set it down with a knowing nod, a small kindness that announced himself as a reliable human in a city that often refracted into a series of transactions. A child's mitten stuck to the inside of the glass door with a smear of mud. A bulletin board by the register held laminated flyers for piano lessons, lost cats, and a notice about the shelter collecting coats. Ordinary things that to Clare smelled faintly like compromise. She watched people as she always watched people, close enough to read the margin where their lives met decision. There was a man at the next table reading aloud to his daughter from a battered paperback, the child's foot tapping in time with a point in the story. Across the room, a woman typed with a concentration that made her jaw rigid. Behind the counter, the barista hummed a carol with the same practical attention she put into milk froths. The bell over the door jingled. It took Clare half a breath to notice the sound had changed the room's temperature. A man came in from the winter as if he'd carried the storm in his bones. His coat was sodden at the shoulders. His hair clung in dark curls across his forehead. He carried a satchel that had seen better days, and a weight in his left eye that made him seem smaller than he might have been in dry clothes.
He looked apologetic in the way of people who had been working hard all night and were not ashamed of it. He hesitated at the threshold as if scanning for a face he had promised, and then his gaze caught on Clare's table. He smiled with a sharp, tired honesty. "Sorry," he said, and the word was an opening, a broom swipe across what she had been defending herself against. 47 minutes? Clare blinked. She hadn't told anyone how long she had been waiting. The man's voice carried a regional softness. There was a working voice steadiness to it that didn't apologize for its own needs. He took off his coat with slow, deliberate motions that suggested a hands-on life. Water peeled from its hem onto the floor in a small, threaded constellation. "You're early," Clare said, executive by instinct, not unkind but precise. He laughed in a way that accepted the correction. "I meant to be. The bus—" He exhaled a breath that contained a half-sentence. "I couldn't. I'm David. I owe you an apology." He set the satchel down and sat opposite her with a posture that was tired and useful. Up close she noticed his hands first, broad, with the faint grease beneath a thumbnail, a callus like a little architecture of labor. They closed around a paper cup as if it were a thing in need of tending. "I'm Clare," she said. She watched him because she had been practicing looking at strangers with the economy of a person who had learned how to measure risk. The man nodded toward the satchel and very deliberately unfastened a corner of a napkin-cushioned bundle. He pulled out a rectangle of folded paper so small it might have been easily missed, and then a cookie wrapped only halfway in wax paper. The cookie was a craggy, home-baked thing, sugar giving it a toothsome sheen. On the outside of the wax paper, in a child's round, decisive scrawl, someone had written, "Thank you for waiting." Beside the cookie, still damp from being in a sweater pocket or a small palm, was a crayon drawing. Clare saw a circle with a large smile and 3 stick figures beneath: a man, a smaller figure with pigtails, and another figure that perhaps represented something new and uncertain. In crayon letters that leaned to the right, a child had written, "Daddy and his new friend. Merry Christmas." Words kept themselves simple in that room. The drawing landed in the middle of the table like a small, honest probe. Clare felt the edges of her practiced reserve curl inward. Her first strictly practical thought was, an ER? She hadn't known to ask. She hadn't wanted the answer. She had, up to this moment, preserved the fiction of emotional distance as if it were an expensive coat she could pluck on when needed. David's gaze flicked to the drawing when she saw her face. "Emma," he said, and said the name with a softness that was both protective and exhausted. She drew it on the ride home from the hospital. I didn't know whether to come or not.
She wrapped the cookie herself and said, "If someone waits, they deserve a cookie." Clare felt, with a precision that made her a little dizzy, how one small child's logic could do what all the careful reasoning in her head had not. She thought of the times her life had been a line on a spreadsheet, and the margin around it frayed with nights she couldn't account for. She thought of Margaret's text, and the way the city's snow erased and rewrote the day without her asking. "Is she asked, because there was always the question of illness in these small domestic confessions. "Is she okay?" David shrugged, a musician's movement of shoulders. Bruised, scared. They gave her fluids, some tests. Everything looked all right, but the doctors wanted to watch her. It turned into a whole thing. He tapped the napkin under the cookie with a finger. She fell asleep in my arms on the way home and woke up asking if I brought a friend. It was the kind of detail that could have been comic in another life. Clare felt a small warmth at the edges of her mouth. "Did you tell her I was waiting here?" she asked, and when he laughed, his laugh was a kind that accepted the ridiculousness of adult considerations in the face of a child's clarity. "I told her you were right here," he said. "She wanted you to know." He reached across the table as if to return the drawing to its rightful owner, his daughter's small diplomatic diplomacy, but his hand hovered and retreated. "I didn't want to give you the wrong impression. I mean," he stopped and fixed his gaze on Clare, not with an aggressive need, but with a plain, exact look. "I'm a dad. He didn't say single. He let the word compress into an adjective that sat in the room, heavy and true. There, in the space between them, the crumpled napkin and the cookie acted like currency. Clare found herself cataloging practical details without meaning to. The way his shirt clung at the collar from the rain, the humor lines at the corner of his eye, the way he folded a napkin to wipe a drip from the table. He was not rehearsed. He was not the sort of person who had learned to smooth edges to make himself acceptable. He was, in the practical ways that mattered, obvious. She could have excused herself then. She could have closed her notebook, stood up, and walked back to the kind of life where presence was scheduled and love was tidy in its deliverables. She looked at the drawing again, at the child's bold Merry Christmas that tilted toward hope. She felt with an unaccountable misdemeanor of feeling, a small looseness. Waiting, she thought, the word felt like a hinge, is when the room asks you a question. Her phone buzzed on the table. She had rehearsed this. Whoever called would be given a practice to polite delay. Her assistant had her calendar. The board meeting had been postponed until next week. She had, in the meantime, fortified her day against the mild erosions of human life. She picked up, thumbed the screen, and found the incoming call was from Margaret. For a flash, she considered ignoring it, and then answered. "Well?" Margaret said, and there was the exact tone of someone handing another the reins of daring. "Have you done it?" "Margaret," Clare began, then let the words sit like a small reconciliation. "I'm meeting someone." She felt ridiculous trying to explain a meeting that had become a test of character. "Is she cute?" Margaret asked, voice eager, the way a person looks for detail under stress, like light under a lens. Clare paused. "It's a man." "Then the answer still applies." Margaret's chuckle was conspiratorial. "Listen, you can leave if you want. There is no rule that you must be moved by cookies or crayon drawings. But if you walk out now, you'll always wonder." Clare let the silence thicken in the way she often did at the end of difficult choices. She told her assistant she would be late to the dinner, negotiated a reschedule of a call, and sent a short message promising she would return to the office early the next morning. The lines she had drawn for herself, work calls, commute, legal obligations, flexed in a way that did not break. Life, she was learning in precise increments, allowed for a negotiation. When she replaced the phone, David's expression was simple and honest. "You don't have to," he said. He said it as if he understood the social gravity of a woman who timed her kindness and measured the moral currency of small acts. Clare looked down at the drawing again. Emma had given the president of a sensible life a test. "All right," she said. Her voice tried on softness like a borrowed coat.
I'll come, for a little while. He breathed like a man who had been holding his breath in that café for hours. The bell over the door jingled as if to mark stations of decision. They gathered their things slowly, David folding his wet coat, Claire crossing off an internal list in which reserve had been checked but not yet cancelled. The napkin with the child's handwriting made a quiet sound in her hand, like a small negotiation. Outside, the city had whitened more decisively. Snow had a way, on good days, of making the present look generous. Claire had an umbrella in her bag that she used mostly on errands where appearances mattered. David, to her mild astonishment, did not have an umbrella. His jacket was saturated, and a ribbon of damp ran along the hem. He ran one hand over his hair as if smoothing the storm away. He walked with the easy, corrective pace of someone used to guiding a small person across a slippery curb. "You live far?" Claire asked, avoiding the way her voice could become managerial. "Not far. 2 stops on the 6. He led and she followed, not because he had authority, but because the path he took felt practical. City sidewalk, bus shelter, the blur of commuters. The bus was nearly empty, a capsule of strangers in winter clothes.
David took a seat by the window and pulled his satchel onto his knees, checking a small list tucked into a pocket. The list was a set of domestic instructions: milk, Band-Aids, library books, written in his precise hand. Claire watched his fingers smooth the paper with the kind of attention one gives to a map when one is trying to find a route one hasn't yet traveled. In the seat beside him, Claire noticed the gentleness in how he answered the bus driver's gruff question about the fare. He exchanged small courtesies with people in line, a seat offered, a step made for a stroller. There was a decency here that had no press release and required no proclamation. It was the kind that accumulates in long, practical lists of doing. On their way, David told her in even, plain sentences about the night at the hospital. Emma had been running a fever that wouldn't break. He had paced the ER lobby with an astringent patience that men who are single parents refine quickly, balancing waiting rooms, alternate caregivers, the paradox of holding on and letting go. He had sat with Emma through monitors, and a woman with a soft voice had said words like observation and reassurance, which are often kinder terms for the uncertainty that lives in the margins of small bodies. The city slid by in snow-blurred panels, a florist boarding up, a teacher struggling with a folding cart, an old couple stepping around an overfull trash can. Each image was an ordinary fact that steadied them in the small narrative they were beginning. When the bus stopped at his corner, David stood, thinning into an economy of motion that felt efficient without being hasty. They walked the last block in the hush that snow gives, a muffling that makes voices sound fainter than they are. The building was a narrow brick place, with a stair rail that needed paint, and a mailbox half filled with winter catalogs. Someone had set a small wreath on the door, a string of mismatched lights hummed with municipal fatigue. As he fumbled with keys, David told her about the sketchbook he kept in a top drawer. He'd been an architect once, he said, before plumbing calls and the after-hours that come with being the only grown-up at home. He kept a small collection of charcoal studies he made in the evenings when Emma was asleep, he said, as if naming the thing made it more respectable. He worked on remodels in the daytime, helped friends with past jobs, and still, when he could, sketched houses as if to remember what he once planned for others, and now planned more modestly, but perhaps more honestly, for his own. The door opened onto a small foyer that smelled faintly of orange peel and detergent. There were, in neat proximity, the shoes of a child's small size, and a forgotten mitten, a magnet on the hall wall with the image of a cartoon pizza, and a library postcard announcing a winter story hour. The living room was compact and luminous in the way of a place that had learned how to keep its warm spots. A couch with a throw that looked like it had been repaired rather than replaced, a coffee table with a scattering of picture books and a stack of magazines no one had yet admitted to finishing. Then she saw Emma, a small figure in pajama leggings with a cardigan over it, hair in a single untamed braid, standing barefoot on the threshold to the kitchen with a pink cup in her hands. She was like all 7-year-olds, fierce in her own logic and entirely candid. She watched Claire with the unfiltered curiosity that children afford strangers. "Daddy?" she asked, tilting her head as if trying to reconcile a mental inventory of what fathers do with the sight of a woman who had been, apparently, worth waiting for. David smiled in a way that seemed to come straight from the core of someone who had been parented with clear rituals. "This is Claire," he said simply. She waited. Emma handed the cup to her father and stepped forward with the kind of authority children are born with when they have been given the job of deciding matters of heart. She thrust a hand toward Claire. "I made this," she announced, as if a proclamation could legislate welcome. She produced, with the proud economy of a child, a crayon drawing. The stick figures were more confident when seen up close. The letters sloped like a small person speaking with intensity.
"That's Daddy, that's me, and that's you," she said, pointing. "Merry Christmas." Claire felt again the small burglary of those two words. They were not meant to steal anything, they had no arms and no claim, but they inserted themselves into the room like a third presence. She looked at Emma, at the earnestness in her face, and felt the edges of a plan in her head have a little steam loosen from them. The practical part of her catalogued the details. The cardigan had a small patch at one elbow. The living room's lamp hummed at a certain frequency. A child's library book had a bookmark folded into it. "Everyone deserves a cookie for good manners," Emma declared, and offered the half-wrapped cookie to Claire with an abundance that embarrassed her into being human. The wax paper was warm from having been held in small hands. The sugar dusted her fingers the way snow dusted the city moments ago. It was a small domestic weather. Claire took the cookie and, without thinking, opened the wax paper and bit into it. The taste was warm butter and a little spice, cinnamon maybe. It tasted like something made by someone who had time and care to measure and to fold the dough just so. The immediate physical pleasure of the cookie landed inside her like a theological argument she hadn't expected to hear. Presence matters. David sat on the couch and watched them both with a tired, approving look. She tells it like it is. Sometimes it's the only way.
They talked about small things that lay like handrails between people. What Emma liked to read, a battered copy of Where the Wild Things Are with the corner of one page chewed. What neighborhood events they liked. How the neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, always knitted an extra scarf and left it at the mailbox for those who needed it. Claire found herself telling them, haltingly, about an apartment she had been cataloging to sell, about the odd symmetry of lists that were both liberating and strange. It felt not quite like confession, more like a negotiation of self, a small ledger of the parts of life she was willing to share. At one point, her phone buzzed again. There is an economy to obligations, to what you must answer and what you can let sit. She silenced it and put it face down on the table. For the first time since the divorce, she allowed herself not to perform the immediate responsiveness that had governed so much of her life. The sound of a timer from the kitchen interrupted the discussion, sharp and domestic. Emma ran to the oven and opened it with ceremonious care. Inside, a small tray of cookies had browned at the edges and filled the apartment with a smell that seemed born for rooms like this. David reached for a dish towel and fumbled with an oven mitt like a man rediscovering ritual. Claire noticed how the living space was made to accommodate a small person, the coffee table a little scarred from crayons, a bookshelf bending under children's chapter books stacked sideways to preserve spines. There were practical systems in place, a small caddy with fever medicine and a digital thermometer, a clipboard by the door with a list of emergency numbers that had been marked in a tidy hand. In the bedroom, she glimpsed soft bedding folded at the foot of a small bed and a nightlight in the shape of the moon. These were the infrastructure of care, not novels about love, but actual acts, boiled rice for a stomachache, a hand pressed to a forehead in the quiet of midnight. "Do you want to stay?" David asked at last. His question was practical and immediate. It wasn't asked in the deep, cinematic sense of a proposal. It was offered in the real terms that held their own gravity. Someone must stay with Emma if the fever returned. She might cry in the night, and two adults had more bandwidth than one. It was an invitation to do the modest, binding labor that love sometimes is. Claire's instinct was to measure everything, the length of her commute, the pending presentations, the timeliness of flights she might book for a client. There were consequences to generosity, small and precise. She thought of her condo, its clean lines, the way she had not yet replaced the chipped mug she used because she liked the way the chip balanced the rest of the room's symmetry. She thought of the neatness of her life, in which people were welcome if they could make an appointment. But there is a kind of calculation that doesn't involve numbers, only the weight of a moment. Claire felt the 47 minutes like an accounting practice. If she stayed, what would she be paying? In what currency? The hour? The warmth of a couch? The risk of being seen as someone who could be softened by a child's drawing? "Just for a little while," she said. The phrase was both promise and hedge. "That would be great," David said. He made space for her in a way that required no grand speech. He moved a blanket from the back of the couch and tossed it over his lap like a small treaty. Emma climbed up, contented, and settled against his side, thumb searching for a comfort that was as ordinary as breathing. She pushed the crayon drawing into Claire's lap with the intentioned authority of a monarch. "So you can know us," she said, and blinked at Claire with the fragile certainty of a child who believed logistics could make belonging. Claire asked for a glass of water, but found herself rinsing stray sugar from the cookie under the tap, and then inexplicably wiping the crumbs from the coffee table with a practiced economy of motion that had once impressed colleagues, and now, applied to this small room, looked like tenderness. The thing she had always been proud of, her ability to make order, was here converted into small care. She did not announce her conversion.
She performed it in dishcloths and gentle, precise gestures. They read a story together. Emma chose a book about an adventureful dog who liked puddles, and Claire, with a voice she had kept warm in the bank of her throat, read out loud. Her sentences smoothed into a cadence that was not entirely unfamiliar. There was a part of her that had missed being permitted to slow. Two heads leaned into the story, one small and earnest, one tired in a way that made Claire's chest ache with a sympathetic ache she had rarely permitted to register. David watched them, and with an odd little student-like humility, opened a chipped tin and took out a pen to sketch the curve of the living room sofa as if recalling a lesson. At some point, the house settled into the gentle friction of being inhabited. The radiator clicked and sighed like a tired animal. Outside, the city sound reduced to a soft, distant shush. Emma's breathing grew deeper, the kind of breath that arrives when a child's storms find rest. Claire found herself close enough to see the smallness of the scar on Emma's knee, the light in her lashes, a tiny smudge of crayon on the back of a hand. Time in the apartment had rearranged itself toward the immediate and the domestic, a sort of small miracle that did not need trumpets. David whispered, almost as if he were continuing a thought left mid-sentence. If this had been anyone else, he began, and then stopped, as if naming the variables of risk had become too heavy for the early hour. I might not have come, I might have decided not to come at all, but she wanted someone to know she waited.
He brushed his thumb along the edge of the drawing. She's persistent like that. Claire understood, in a way that didn't require words, that this was not meant to be a plea. It was an inventory of exhaustion and small courage. Here was a man who had spent the night in the service of another's breath. There was no melodrama in the statement, only the naked fact of priority. "Thank you for bringing her home," Claire said, quietly. The words felt like a checksum closing a small loop. David smiled without overreaching. "Thank you for sitting." They measured durations in new ways. 47 minutes had been a test, a small experiment in whether she would allow herself to be in the presence of someone else's ordinariness. The drawing lay between them like an unlikely contract. Claire thought of how waiting had become a verb in her life, not a passive posture, but a moral aperture that could make available something other than isolation. The city, the café, the cookie, the child's handwriting, each small detail had been an instrument, and now she had found herself returning with them into a rental building that smelled of orange and detergent. She had chosen for a little while to step off the list of obligations and into an unadvertised responsibility to presence. That was, for the moment, enough to be significant. She had not promised more than she could keep. She had made no vows she could not count on. She had simply, almost mathematically, shifted the sum. A late dinner would be rescheduled, and early morning would be tacked on to the end of a busy week. These were small transactions. They did not solve the big ledgers of life, but they made an architecture of the ordinary that might, if tended, become something livable. Outside, snow softened and writhed around the streetlights. Inside, in a small apartment whose heating bill was paid in careful installments, 3 people, a man who had been up all night, a child who had rallied against fears with crayon diplomacy, and a woman who had scheduled her charity with the exactitude of a banker, found themselves negotiating the simple commerce of company. Emma's drawing, still sticky with the small pressures of childhood, rested on Claire's knee like a map. She smoothed it with the mechanical tenderness that finds its home in small hands. Before she left the couch, she looked at the clock on the mantel, and for the first time since she agreed to come, counted not with the austere arithmetic of professional life, but with a domestic practice of moments. The seconds did not seem to be measured against potential loss, but against present warmth. She had been waiting 47 minutes in a café, and found, suddenly, that being where someone needed you had its own currency. A buzzer sounded from the hallway, a call, perhaps, from someone with an appointment, a neighbor's late return. It sliced through the soft domesticity like a reminder that obligations are never quite shelved. David glanced toward the door, as if listing possible outcomes. Claire pulled her coat more tightly around her shoulders, and, in a voice that was sudden and steadier than she felt, said, "I'll stay. For now." He nodded as if the answer satisfied a ledger. Emma, half asleep now and still warm against him, looked up and handed Claire the drawing, as if passing along a responsibility. "Keep it," she said decisively, "so you'll remember." Claire held the paper between her fingers. The waxed creases made soft ridges. "Merry Christmas." The 2 words were both an offering and a test. She folded the drawing and tucked it into the pocket of her coat like a small talisman she had not known she needed. The snow outside made a particular hush against the window, and in that hush, the apartment felt like a place where practical love, the staying, the baking, the watching, could take its first tidy, stubborn shape. If someone were to have asked her in that exact second what this meant for the long lines of her life, for schedules, for finances, for the precise veneer of independence she had cultivated, she would have given them a correct and polite answer that did not require courage. But at the base of her chest, under the careful cataloging of consequences, something else had shifted, a small readiness to negotiate what had once been intolerable. It did not announce itself with trumpets. It moved like snow into place, small, incremental, and stubborn. Margaret's text, "Be kind, be brave," had turned out to be less a dare than a permission. Clare had allowed herself a kindness she had not yet named. She had permitted the possibility of being present, for once, not managed. Standing in that small living room with a child's handwriting warm against her thumb, she found herself making a decision whose importance would not be measured by a single night, but by the cumulative, habitual presence it might invite. Have you ever waited for someone who finally showed up? If this is speaking to you, tell us in the comments. They moved through the apartment in small, necessary rituals. Emma tucked into bed with a small chorus of stuffed animals arrayed like worried counselors, a thermos of warm milk prepared with the exactness of a pharmacist, a bowl of cookies placed on the coffee table for later. Clare, who had practiced efficiency like a craft, found herself drawn into the messier liturgies of care, mending a hem with a thread she had found in her bag, untangling a knot from a braid, smoothing a blanket with the odd ceremonial caress of someone learning how to be domestic again. David made tea and poured a second cup for her without asking. He moved with the economy of a man used to splitting himself into compartments for work and childcare, and found a new habit in the making, closing the gap between tasks and tenderness.
In the small space of an apartment, among the smells of orange and butter, the architecture of days began to redraw itself in little gestures. He sat across from her on the couch and, without theatricality, began to tell a story of a house he had once designed that had a staircase with an odd, crooked banister. His voice found a rhythm that suggested he had been waiting, like a pipe waiting for the right draw, for someone to listen. Clare had the odd and distinct pleasure of hearing him describe spaces as if they were living things, detailing decisions he had once argued for in blueprints and late nights. It was a graceful thing to watch, the slow, adult reclaiming of a younger, more public talent, now compressed into the private geometry of family life. They spoke in short sentences that gave no metaphysical guarantees and no attempts to fix the underpinnings of a life complicated by bills and single-parent routines. They shared small confessions. Clare had never learned to fry eggs properly. David had once cried when a client stormed out of a renovation disagreement and he had to let go of a contract. The confessions were the kind that have the texture of reality, no grand promises, only the facts of who they were on a Tuesday night. Outside, snow thickened. The city pulled its coat up and kept moving. Inside, the living room lights softened until it was almost indistinguishable from the glow of a person's attention. The crayon picture lay folded in Clare's pocket, a soft weight against her thigh. For the first time in a long while, she let herself think of the future not as a ledger to be balanced, but as a set of possible habits. Wednesdays with pancakes, small repairs done with friends instead of contractors, the possibility of a voice at the end of a long shift saying, without theatrics, "I'm here." The night had been promised as one thing, a brief Margaretesque experiment in being available, and turned into another, a domestic test in the language of care. She had not and would not rewrite her entire life for the sake of a child's drawing, but she had, in the space of an hour and a few small decisions, made herself available. In the way that mattered, that availability was the surprise of the evening. They did not yet know what shape it would take. The practicalities would trudge on, bills, on-call shifts, the slow procession of paperwork for a condo sale. There would be nights of compromise and mornings of argument, and there would be no miraculous solutions. But in the apartment's warm hush, the small rituals began to line up like bricks. Cookies, drawing, a story read aloud, a promise to stay, for now. Clare folded the child's drawing once more and slid it back into her pocket. She sat on the couch, somewhere between decision and consequence, and allowed the small domestic warmth to settle. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and unremarkable.
Inside, for the first time in a long while, the waiting felt like an answer rather than a sentence. Morning came slow and coppery. Clare woke to the soft, regular sound of someone turning pages somewhere in the apartment, and for a breath she couldn't remember who was doing it. The room smelled faintly of tea and orange oil, and the living room lamp threw a small oval of light against the ceiling, warm as a promise. Emma slept with her thumb at the corner of her mouth, and a little curl of hair pressed to the pillow. David sat in the armchair, head bowed over a paperback, an ordinary domestic posture that made the space between the two adults feel safe and unfinished in the best way. Claire sat up and folded the blanket, the action measured and small. The child's drawing was still in her coat pocket. She smoothed the fold before she let herself put it back. For a moment she watched David from across the room, the way his knee bumped the arm of the chair, the small furrow at his brow when he read something that made him think. He looked like someone who kept things in order through habitual motion rather than lists. She liked that about him, the unremarked skill of tending. "Morning," he said without looking up. His voice came out halting, as if he were testing whether the day would demand urgency. "Morning," she answered. The word felt larger than it had any right to be. She padded to the kitchen and found he had left a small muddle of dishes in the sink and a tidy kettle on the stove. He met her at the counter with 2 mugs. He handed one to her with a kind of quiet offering, an exchange that required no clause. Emma's arrival was as particular as any child's, a knobby knee first, then a small foot finding the floor with the same decisive curiosity she had shown the night before. "Did you stay?" she asked, checking Claire as if one might be a weather vane for moral choices. Claire set her mug down, feeling the warmth at the base of her fingers. "I did," she said. She watched Emma cross the kitchen and take a cookie from the tin on the counter, then pop it into her mouth with the unceremonious delight of someone who expected life to be good for small stretches. They moved through morning as if in rehearsal for things that might be habitual someday. Claire boiled water and scorched the first attempt at French press coffee. David busied himself scraping a stubborn pan with the patience of someone who had learned to keep a household running on small reserves. Emma watched them both as if keeping a ledger of affection, and when she spoke she made it sound like a policy decision. "You can stay here," she told Claire, and then, as if that required an amendment, "only if you always bring cookies." Claire laughed, a short, surprise sound she hadn't expected to hear from herself so early in the day. It landed in her like a small, bright coin. She felt the absurdity of a life ruled by contracts, humored by the simplicity of a child's rule.
They made practical plans between sips of coffee. Claire called her assistant at the office and, in the background, negotiated a meeting time that padded her morning but did not dissolve it. The exchange was competent and unromantic. A calendar shifted, a client appeased with a reschedule, a note made to call back after lunch. The everyday friction of her life had not been erased, it had been reorganized. She liked that reorganization. It suggested that generosity did not have to be sacrificial, it could be integrated. "Are you sure?" David asked then, careful. "You don't need to." "No," Claire said, "I'm sure." He watched her as if noting a detail, like the way a carpenter measures twice before cutting, and then he put his own hand, calloused and warm, on the back of a chair and said, "If anything comes up with you, with your work, just tell me. Don't—" He stopped, searching for a shape for what he meant. "We'll work it out." They set a rhythm for the day. Claire would check her emails during Emma's morning show and tell at school if needed. David would take a call if a pipe burst and a neighbor needed help. Between them, they would carve out a week that could hold both of their lives. The conversation turned practical and specific, not grand. Claire learned, in the first honest talk of their grown-up negotiations, that the small agreements were the ones that would make or unmake them. By midweek, Claire had returned to her condo to fetch a few essentials she couldn't live without: a lamp she treasured, a stack of files she needed for an upcoming presentation, a small box of things she kept for no reason more substantial than sentiment. Margaret called twice in the afternoon, once to ask if she had slipped into something permanent, and again to ask whether she had remembered to breathe. Claire told Margaret she was learning to do so in increments. The process of selling a home turned out to be the patient, bureaucratic thing that people who like tidy spreadsheets both loathe and understand. Claire interviewed 2 agents, one young, earnest, and flip, the other a woman with silver hair who understood the precise decorum of staging and offered a reading of the penthouse with surgical detail. She chose the older agent. There were measurements made, rugs rented, a consultation with a stager who folded blankets the way a curator arranges an exhibit. Margaret popped by once, bringing a plant and an opinion, and watched Claire walk through rooms she had curated into a picture of an ideal life and now must detach from. Claire felt a strange kind of grief in the ritual of removal. Each object put into a box felt like a small admission that some lines of her life were in fact negotiable. She wrapped fragile items with a care that felt almost religious, and when Emma came over one Saturday to help, having insisted on seeing Claire's big house, she handed the child a marker and a stack of sticky notes.
"Label anything that is actually yours," Claire told her, and Emma took to the task with fierce concentration. She wrote "declutter" on a sticky note and stuck it to a lamp, which made both women laugh. It was a tiny, necessary levity in the midst of a process that otherwise smelled like contracts and fees. Selling did not proceed as dramatically as novels sometimes suggest. Offers came and stalled. One buyer made an offer, then withdrew when his financing fell through at the last minute. The agent recommended patience, sophistication, and a price reduction that Claire did not relish, but which made the listing more attractive. There were appraisals and inspections, and the bureaucratic coldness of paperwork that asked intimate questions about mortgage history and maintenance records. Claire listened, acted, and watched the ledger of her life shift small degrees in exchange for a different kind of living. David kept his steady small emergencies. A pipe burst in a neighbor's bathroom one morning, and he spent the better part of a day soaked and apologetic, and then a little proud when water ran clear again and the neighbor's frown had softened. He declined, definitively, one call for an emergency that would have taken him out overnight, and asked instead if someone he trusted could handle it, a compromise that felt strange and necessary. He came home with a new habit of checking the oil on the van and making lists for trips to the hardware store. Claire watched him with the same observation she had long applied to colleagues, noticing habits that made a life work under pressure. They grew into the provisional domesticity of two people negotiating an unpaid night. There were weekends they spent well. Saturday pancakes, burned at the edges sometimes, flipped with care by David, and sometimes managed with an awkward flair by Claire when she attempted eggs and lost the yolk. There were evenings when Emma insisted on a second bedtime story, and they alternated pages like partners in a duet. Claire learned to fold a fitted sheet better than she ever had, and David learned to make a grocery list that didn't contain only the words milk and bread. They scaffolded their lives with small improvements rather than dramatic moves. The months that followed were a sequence of specific, unspectacular days, stitched to a few bright points. The montage of their lives was not cinematic so much as domestic, a slow burn of repeated actions that accumulated into habit. Claire's condo showed in a dozen weekend viewings. Each visitor moved through rooms as if scanning for a place to project a life. The stager came back twice. There was a mid-process inspection that turned up a burned-out outlet, and the humbling discovery that even tidy lives require maintenance. David came over one afternoon to fix a loose hinge he noticed while helping move a box.
He stood at Claire's kitchen counter with his sleeves rolled up, working by habit, and she watched the ease with which his hands remembered craft. He did not dazzle with expertise so much as decency. He explained what he was doing and why, and she felt the comfort of explanation. A small setback occurred in late winter. A buyer had made an earnest offer, the kind of clean, plausible contract Claire could plan around, but during the closing process, their financing slowed. There were more forms, more waiting rooms, a week of emails at odd hours trying to nudge the process forward. Claire felt the old instinct her work had bred, to call, to schedule, to prod. In a quiet middle-of-the-night negotiation, she called David, who took the line and offered, in a low, steady voice, to hand over a small favor. He knew a guy who had a contractor who knew a lawyer. It was not a miraculous fix. It was a practical connection, an exchange among people who did things for each other. Ultimately, the sale went through with a slightly lower price than she'd hoped, but it went through, and the relief that came with it felt accurate and earned. Emma settled into school routines with the unbothered resilience children possess. She began bringing home projects and crayon pictures with alarming frequency. One afternoon, she produced a new drawing and pushed it across the kitchen table with the grave satisfaction of someone who had completed a task. It showed 3 figures under a tree and a small house, and beneath it, in a carefully deliberate hand, the words, "Waiting was good." Claire put the drawing on the refrigerator and left it there a week, as if it were a talisman showing how small decisions could grow into larger stories. At times, the strain of overlapping lives pressed against the edges. Claire had to travel for work, a 2-day meeting with clients who expected her punctuality and her exactitude. She booked the flight, fitted meetings into the day, and left the house with a suitcase that reminded her of older versions of herself. She told David the schedule, and then, at the airport, found herself thinking of Emma and the way the child's small eyelashes caught the light. She extended the trip by a few hours to rearrange a presentation. The time she carved out was not heroic, but logistical. On her return, she found a pot of soup on the stove and a child asleep with a library book fallen to the floor like a loyal companion. David's note on the counter said only, "You did great." The smallness of the message made it large. There were arguments, too, of the sort that come when lives are no longer parallel but entangled. Once, after a long week, Claire suggested they consider bringing on some regular help with childcare so she could attend a Friday evening work event. David bristled, not at the help so much as at the idea of outsourcing. "It's not that I'm proud," he said, blunt. "It's that time with her is not replaceable."
She listened and then, with the practical mind that served her well, proposed a rotation. She would give up one evening a fortnight if he could arrange a plumber to fix a leak that meant meekly headaches. They negotiated with the ease of two people who had learned to count costs in less abstract currencies than money. Compromise, they discovered, smelled of laundry detergent and unsent emails. David, for his part, began to reopen the sketchbook he had kept tucked away. The charcoal drawings, at first hesitant, grew more confident. He drew small houses, then small interiors, then a couple of floor plans that looked less like designs for clients and more like ideas for a real kitchen or a better bathroom. He mentioned in passing that a neighbor had asked him to bid on a small job, a modest renovation of a bathroom, and he accepted. The job paid in ways that were not large but meaningful. Clare encouraged him in a practical way. She suggested a website, helped him photograph the work, and even mailed a couple of her contacts to a friend looking for someone to consult on a small architectural tweak. It was not charity, it was partnership. The decision to move toward living together was not dramatized. It came in a series of practical conversations and small agreements. Clare decided to list her penthouse and to look for a smaller place that required less maintenance and was closer to Emma's school. She did not rush to cohabitation. Instead, they agreed on a timeline: sell, find a place that worked for the three of them, and then decide if living together made logistical and emotional sense. The plan acknowledged that a romance would not erase mortgages or childcare schedules. It had to accommodate them. Moving day arrived with rain, the kind that makes cardboard boxes soggy if one is not careful. They hired a small crew and a van that smelled faintly of diesel and leather. Emma made a list of things she wanted to keep separate: her stuffed animals, the box of Christmas decorations, her favorite blue blanket. Clare taped the crayon drawing into a box labeled Keep, and then on a small impulse wrote 47 minutes across the lid in black marker, as if to mark the origin story of what was happening. David watched her with a look that could have been a photograph: domestic, modest, full of the gravity of small things. The boxes moved like piecework. The men carried armfuls. Emma ran as an inspector and offered advice on where a lamp might be placed in the new space. Clare filled out a change of address form without drama, and then on a whim paged through a small stack of photographs she had wrapped. One picture was of her and Margaret, arms linked on a rooftop in an older memory she preferred to file under youthful miscalculations. She smoothed the edge and set it aside.
There were frictions. A curtain rod refused to be demounted. A last-minute inspection revealed a small leak near the balcony that had to be fixed quickly. An electrician came and tightened a fuse. Each problem required patience and money, and the two of them negotiated where those funds came from. Clare pulled a modest sum from the sale and kept a buffer for emergencies. David accrued what he could from jobs and insisted on finding ways to balance his books. They talked about wills and lists of emergency contacts, the kind of grown-up things that arrive when households begin to converge. They moved into a smaller place that smelled of paint and new carpets, a place that could have been described coldly as efficient, and which, in the language that matters most to them, felt like a beginning. The moving truck went back across town. Clare handed one of the men a coffee with an expression of gratefulness at having people who would lift things that she could not. Emma taped the crayon drawing to the refrigerator in the new kitchen, careful to put it at eye level for a 7-year-old, and wrote beneath it in sticker letters, "Here." The first night in the new apartment came with the usual small stumbles: a missing kettle lid, a lamp with a flicker that made them all rummage for the spare bulb. But there was also the deliberate practice of new rituals: a bowl of cookies on the table with a note that read, "Thank you for waiting," a phrase that had journeyed from wax paper to tin to a hand-lettered scrap that Emma insisted on creating. The cookie motif held them like a benediction. They discovered neighbors: an elderly man who kept bees on his balcony and whose honey jar smelled like sun, a woman who ran a small music school and brought over scones on a rainy Tuesday. The community, small and practical, provided things neither big nor miraculous: a babysitter who was reliable, a recommendation for a plumber who did not overcharge, a school volunteer who helped with a science fair. Life stitched itself to these practicalities. It was not seamless, but it was steady. Through all of this, there were evenings when Clare thought of her old routines, the predictable rhythm where she booked herself into solitude and then scheduled social life in tidy blocks. She admitted to no grand conversions, only small shifts. She no longer accounted for her day in profit margins alone. In the quiet moments, she found that she liked being counted on. It made her feel responsible in a way that traded the abstract satisfaction of efficiency for the concrete warmth of presence. Emma grew in the small ways that make time visible. She learned to tie her shoes without assistance. She began to rehearse for the school play with an earnestness that left Clare watching in the front row with tears she was loath to admit came from a softer place than sentimentality.
David, who rarely spoke of his own childhood except in short, precise statements, attended every rehearsal that he could, sometimes with a client call in his pocket, but present nonetheless. When Emma said after a rehearsal, "I think you should see this," and dragged him by the sleeve onto a small stage, Clare felt the domestic architecture of her life shift again. The new plan was not an erasure of the old, but an expansion of actions. They argued sometimes about thermostats and bedtime routines. Once, in a small flare of exhausted intonation, Clare snapped at David for leaving a light on. He took the sharpness without dramatics and explained without apology that he had left it on because Emma had been afraid of the dark that night, and it had comforted her. She felt chastened, not by the fact of the light, but by the smallness of the indignation. She apologized later with the awkwardness of someone unused to admitting small failings, and he accepted the apology with the casual grace of ordinary people who want to keep moving forward. As spring threatened, they planned a modest celebration, a shared dinner where friends and neighbors would come, a first invitation to their place as a unit. Clare cooked with tentative bravery, a roast that, in company, made her feel adrift but accomplished when people served seconds. Margaret arrived with a ceramic bowl that she said looked very you, and watched the scene with the sort of triumphant private satisfaction friends reserve for telling stories of other people's lives when they turn out right. It was a domestic victory of the lowly sort, an oven that cooperated, a table that held enough plates. One evening, after Emma was asleep, Clare found herself on the couch with David, the house quiet and the kitchen light spilling like soft currency into the room. He had his sketchbook open, and in the low light she could see the sweep of a pencil across a page that might have once been the scale for a client's commission and now curved into something more human. The plan for a built-in shelf in their small communal study, perhaps, or the first sketch of a porch bench that did not need to be perfect to be useful. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly, without a preamble. She meant the old life, the penthouse, the routines, the clean lines that had been hers alone. He looked at her and then at the page. "Sometimes," he said, "but what I miss less are the things I didn't keep because I didn't have time. I miss adjacencies. I like knowing where she is when I can't see her." She nodded. The admission that she sometimes felt lonely in the old life was small but real. He put down the pencil and reached for her hand on the couch. There was a softness in the gesture that neither of them exaggerated. They did not make declarations. They made plans.
They agreed to a new calendar that included shared responsibilities, and then they talked about safer things. The leaky faucet David still meant to fix, the upcoming parent-teacher conference, a dentist appointment for Emma. The months folded into routine. The crayon drawing that had started it all lived now in a drawer by the kitchen with other ephemera, a ticket stub from a small theater, a restaurant receipt with too much handwriting on it, Emma's first tooth in a small Ziploc bag. The drawing had been tracked by many hands on the way, from Emma's small palm to David's pocket to Claire's coat and finally home again. Each of those transfers felt like a covenant renewed in small increments. On a gray afternoon, months after the first evening, Clare found herself alone in the kitchen with the tin of cookies between her palms. Emma was at school, and David had been called to handle a burst pipe at a neighbor's building. The house felt emptier than usual, and in that absence she did the sort of thinking she used to do while balancing spreadsheets. What have I gained? What have I given up? What remains negotiable? The questions did not demand a single answer so much as a direction. She opened the tin and found a cookie that had been set aside, their tradition, born from the child's diplomacy, to save one. The smell rose like a small benediction. Clare held the cookie between her fingers, watching the light catch the sugar. She thought, as she often did now, about the calculus of presence. There was no dramatic moral to announce. There was only the proof, a cookie that had been saved because someone valued waiting. When David returned that evening, wet and bright-eyed, he washed his hands and then collapsed at the kitchen table, the sort of collapse that is content rather than defeat. He spread the paper of the local plumbing permit between his palms like a talisman. "They'll reimburse some of the cost," he said, pragmatic. Neighbors pitched in. They ate the saved cookie together, not as a ceremony, but as a small communal indulgence. Emma, who had been carrying a backpack full of artwork, spread a new drawing across the table, a picture of a house with 3 windows and a small crooked tree. Beneath it she had written, 47 minutes and counting. They all laughed because the phrase had earned a new life as a running joke that also carried a tenderness. Time, in that way, had become not a ledger, but a measure of lived attention. They did not pretend the work of building a life was easy. They paid bills, then argued about which card to use for a baking class Emma wanted to take, then agreed to delay a vacation. They talked to an accountant about combining certain tax benefits, and then discovered that certain lines had to remain separate for reasons of practicality. Those were the sorts of conversations that make up the scaffolding of domesticity, tedious, necessary, sometimes humbling, often a test of patience.
One winter evening, a year since the café, or close enough to feel like an anniversary, they sat by the window with a patch of snow making the city soft and anonymous. Emma was asleep, the house carrying the quiet of exhausted days. Clare had a folded scrap of the original drawing in the pocket of her robe. She had never let it go. She thought, looking at David as he traced the rim of a coffee cup, that the surprise of Christmas Eve had not been a lightning bolt, but the rearrangement of ordinary elements in a new order. Cookies, drawings, presents. "Do you remember," David said, his voice low, "how you looked at the drawing the first night, like someone who had been handed instructions she wasn't sure she wanted to follow?" She laughed a little. "I remember counting the minutes and thinking I'd done something reckless." Her voice softened. "I also remember feeling, inexplicably, that if I didn't act, I'd always ask myself what might have been." He nodded, his face the exact mix of amusement and warmth she had come to recognize. "It took me a long time to go back to the sketchbook. I kept telling myself it was practical to let it sleep, but she kept drawing. She gave me reasons." They sat in the small domestic glow and let the quiet settle. Outside, snow fell in a friendly, undemanding way. Inside, the house held the artifacts of a life in progress, a shelf where Emma's school trophies were lined up like small soldiers, a stack of magazines with dog-eared pages that were recipes they'd liked, a jar of coins for a weekend bus trip. There was no proclamation to be made, only the lived evidence of presence. At some point that night, Emma came out of her bedroom, hair in a tangle and eyes still heavy with sleep. She put her small feet on the floor and climbed into the couch between them, which she called the cuddle spot, in a voice that made both adults smile. She put her head on Claire's shoulder with the decisive intimacy of a child who knows how to make a home. Claire wrapped an arm around her, feeling the precise weight of a small person who trusted them both. "We should make a jar for people who wait," Emma suggested, as if she were giving the world a policy proposal. "Then when someone waits, we give them a cookie from the jar." "It already exists," David said, amused. He pressed a kiss to the top of Emma's head. "It's called the cookie tin." Emma leaned back and looked at them both like a judge. "And you," she said, pointing at Claire with gentle severity, "remember when you waited? You said you'd stay. Are you still staying?" Claire felt the question like a small mirror held up to a life she was still building. She looked at David, at the small lines at the edges of his eyes, at the calloused thumb that had once cradled a coffee cup in a cafe. She looked at Emma, who was both the reason and the test of presence. The answer did not require flourish. It required an honesty she had learned by paying attention. "I'm staying."
The words were not theatrical. They were a pragmatic, true statement. There was no immediate contract implied beyond the enduring practice of showing up. The phrase warmed the room. David's hand found hers under the blanket and squeezed, a simple signal that said, in small grammar, "I will be here." Emma made a small sound of approval and fell back asleep, thumb returning to the familiar solace. They did not imagine a flawless future. They knew there would be nights when schedules collided and money was tight and someone would need to take a call at midnight. They knew that their choices would require negotiation and stubbornness and sometimes disappointment. But they also knew the value of the small craftsmanship of care, the changes of sheets, the offered umbrella, the late-night soup, the presence when a fever flared. In the years that followed, life continued with the ordinary insistence of a season that keeps turning. Claire's work shifted but did not stop. She took clients who allowed for the life she had chosen, and she delegated with more trust than she had ever given before. David's plumbing business steadied. His sketchbook grew into a modest portfolio of local renovations that paid in both income and satisfaction. Emma thrived in school, surrounded by people who had learned to love the rhythm of a shared household. On quiet evenings, long after the first, Claire would sometimes take the folded drawing from a drawer and unfold it, smoothing the creases with a thumb, reading the crude letters that said Daddy and his new friend. The drawing had become less a test and more a record, an artifact of a day that taught them how presence can change the architecture of a life. They had learned in the slow accumulation of small acts that love need not be dramatic to matter. Once, years later, they hung a small frame on a wall with the crayon drawing inside, a conscious choice to make the origin visible. Beneath it, they wrote, in Claire's tidy hand, the date of the evening that had set everything in motion, Christmas Eve. Next to it, a small taped note bore a child's handwriting that read, "Thank you for waiting." It was both an offering and a reminder. On cold nights when the light on their kitchen table pooled in the same place and the snow outside softened the city's harsh lines, they would sometimes glance at the clock and joke about the original 47 minutes. It had become a private measure, a small numerological joke that quieted the world. It was not a mythic number. It was a marker of the evening that had opened the possibility of them. "I'll still count down sometimes," Emma would say, dropping a spoon into the jar with coins they saved for small pleasures.
just to remember. Clare would smile and feel the solidity of it all. Not perfection, but the slow, accruing, improbable miracle of presence. She had learned to treat waiting as an invitation, rather than a sentence.
She had seen how refusing to be merely efficient allowed for another grammar of life, one composed of bowls, band-aids, bedtime stories, and weekly meetings kept so someone could make it to a recital. Those things did not erase structural difficulties. Bills still had to be paid, careers managed, health attended to, but they changed the experience of living them. The house, when they arrived at it each night, was more like a record of choices than a trophy. There were marks on the banister where a small hand had traced the grain. There was a scar on the coffee table from where Emma had once knocked a cup in a flurry of excitement. There was, on a high shelf, a small tin labeled "Thank you for waiting," that sometimes, when times were thin, contained nothing more than a few mishmash cookies and a hole in its lid that Emma liked to peep through. The rituals mattered because they were recognizable, habitual, repeatable. What made the life sturdier than sentiment was the way they had learned to negotiate the small arc of their days. Agreements were practical: a shared calendar, a budget for household items, a rotation of responsibilities for school pickups and repairs. The romance that developed was not the subject of a public speech, but the accumulation of these mundane acts. It was a construction job: measure twice, adjust, invest time, reevaluate. They built a home with the same slow competence with which David once traced a banister on paper. On another winter evening, years removed, but also painfully near in emotional memory, Clare stood by a fogged window and looked out at the city softened by snow. The watch on her wrist, an accessory she no longer used as rigorously as she once had, read 5:47. A small smile touched her mouth, one that was not smirking but grateful. She turned from the window and walked to the kitchen where the light made a pool on the table. There, under a jar of pens and a stack of appointment cards, the folded crayon drawing lay like a map of what had shifted everything. David was in the doorway with a small packet of flour down his sleeve and a smear of icing at his chin from a baking experiment he'd insisted on trying. Emma came bustling in, older, hair braided in a more deliberate way, and immediately flung a mittenless hand at Clare's arm. They gathered at the table like three parts of a simple machine that turned on daily presents. Clare put her hands around the sleeves of her coat as if to settle into a decision she had already made 1,000 times in small ways. "I'm staying," she said then, without a theater of ceremony, and there was a steadiness in the declaration that made it whole. It was not a vow to erase difficulty, but a promise to continue the practice of attendance, to answer, to be present, to bake, to read, to listen when a small person needed the calm of a voice. David folded his hand over hers, and with a smile that was both a question and an answer, said, "Good."
They moved forward, as they always had, by attending to the next small task. Elizabeth's school play, a broken radiator, a cake that needed frosting, a mailbox that had not yet been checked. The city outside hummed with other people's choices and small dramas. Inside, in their kitchen warmed by an oven and the kind of light that made ordinary objects glow, the three of them did what families do. They showed up. If someone had asked Clare then whether a child's crayon drawing and a half-wrapped cookie had been enough to change the course of a life, she would have answered honestly. No, they had not been enough in and of themselves. They had been the hinge. The rest, the months of negotiation, the dull paperwork, the urgent plumbing calls, the missed flights, the shared laughter, was the building. But she knew that without the gentle insistence of that child's diplomacy, she might never have tilted. The surprise of Christmas Eve, she thought as she watched Emma draw with a concentration that had not dimmed, was not an event, but a series of choices made visible. We can be counted on. We can change an hour into a habit. We can make a life through repeated small acts. The title of that evening lived now as a quiet domestic legend, a story they told each year in slightly different words to guests and to each other. It remained always the same in spirit. A single dad arrived soaked and exhausted, bearing the work of another sphere, and a woman who had carved a life of order allowed herself to be present. Outside, the snow continued its patient erasure of the city's hard edges. Inside, a tray of cookies cooled on the counter, and a small folded drawing rested beneath a glass paperweight on the table. The simple evidence of a life lived together lay scattered through the rooms. Mismatched mugs, a stack of library books with due dates circled, a tiny blue blanket that Emma refused to abandon no matter how old she grew. They had no illusions that love would solve all practical problems. What they had was gentler and more durable,
a conviction built on attention. They would still contend with bills, with occasional nights of exhaustion, with the ordinary annoyances of shared living. But they also had a practice, to wait, to show up, to bake, to listen, that rendered many of those difficulties bearable. If you found something of yourself in this story, in the small courage it sometimes takes to be present, in the domestic rituals that end up meaning more than grand gestures, pass it along. Share this with someone who might need the quiet reminder that presence is a kind of love worth practicing. And if you like stories that linger and warm like a cup of tea, subscribe for more.